Hi guys. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the Denny motion, the Denny ruling in Stephen Avery's case. This is a document that I'm reading from, is the defendant's response to state's motion to prohibit evidence of third-party liability, the Denny motion. In the introduction it says, the state seeks an order prohibiting Stephen Avery from arguing or otherwise introducing any evidence or inference that third parties other than Stephen Avery or Brendan Dassey are responsible for the homicide of Teresa Halbach unless Avery identifies with specificity, I hate that word, the individual or individuals responsible for the victim's death. How hard is that to do? I mean, first of all, you have to do an investigation. The police had to do a proper investigation of all the potential suspects and, follow all those leads so that the defense could even possibly do that. But, they made that impossible, but we're going to go on. And further satisfies the legitimate tendency test of State versus Denny. The state also seeks to extend the Denny test in similar degree of specificity to prohibit any argument or evidence that evidence against Avery was planted. Avery acknowledges that the Denny rule must be satisfied should he decide to offer third-party liability evidence other than against Dassey, but denies the state's implication that the recent United States Supreme Court decision of Holmes v. South Carolina increased the defense burden to satisfy the Denny rule. Avery further rejects the state's assertion that Denny applies to any defense effort to challenge the authenticity of the evidence the state presents against him. Sorry, my cat is saying hello again. The argument, this is Section A, the Denny rule. In State versus Denny, the court considered what limits reasonably could be placed on a defendant's effort to ascribe responsibility to a third party for the crime charged. The court imposed a legitimate tendency test as follows. We believe that to show legitimate tendency, a defendant should not be required to establish the guilt of third persons with that degree of certainty requisite to sustain a conviction in order for this type of evidence to be admitted. So basically, they don't have to prove that the person did it beyond a reasonable doubt so that there could be a conviction if that evidence was presented against that person in trial. On the other hand, evidence that simply affords a possible ground of suspicion. Yeah, he wants to say hello. Otherwise, a defendant could conceivably produce. Okay, hold on, I gotta go back now. Distracting cat. On the other hand, evidence that simply affords a possible ground of suspicion against another person should not be admissible. So basically, they can't just go around accusing random people of this crime without some kind of evidence. Otherwise, that will create issues. Otherwise, a defendant could conceivably produce evidence tending to show that hundreds of other persons had some motive or animus against the deceased, degenerating the proceedings into a trial of collateral issues. Basically what I just said, that you could totally distract the jury with hundreds of alternate suspects and ridiculousness by just being allowed to freely accuse anyone. So they do have to put limitations on it, which is very understandable. The legitimate tendency test asks whether the proffered evidence is so remote in time, place, or circumstances that a direct connection cannot be made between the third person and the crime. So basically, was this person in the right place? Possibly. And I know that Stephen Avery listed several alternate suspects in the beginning that could have had something to do with Teresa's death. And a lot of those people were other members of his family or a customer that had been on the property on that day. So he's basically showing that they were within proximity, just like it says. Thus, as long as motive and opportunity have been shown, and as long as there is also some evidence to directly connect a third person to the crime charged, which is not remote in time, place, or circumstances, the evidence should be admissible. So those people should have been allowed to be introduced as alternate suspects, according to this. By illustration, where it is shown that a third person not only had the motive and opportunity to commit the crime, but also was placed in such proximity to the crime as to show he may have been the guilty party, the evidence would be admissible. So basically, here's the problem. Motive. No one could prove a motive for Stephen Avery. And Stephen Avery, in his defense, could not prove a motive for anyone else. But they could prove all these other very interesting circumstances and opportunity, being in the right place, other suspicious activity. Lots of suspicion here that should have been investigated. The only problem here is that they could not prove a motive, and that's the big hang up here. There is no motive. There is no way to prove a motive unless you basically have found the real killer. They gave a confession and they told you why they did it, and you know all of this. You can't introduce them under this ruling as, being an alternate suspect to give the jury reasonable doubt, which it really, really limited the defense from putting on a full defense for Stephen, because this ruling just really should not have been part of this trial. Let's see. Denny has been adopted by the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and Avery acknowledges its application in this case should he seek to introduce evidence of third-party liability for Teresa Halbach's death. Blah, blah, blah. However, Avery disagrees with the state's implication that Holmes versus South Carolina has made the Denny burden more difficult in this case. The state claims that Holmes held that where there is strong forensic evidence of a defendant's guilt, evidence of third-party liability does not raise reasonable inference as to the defendant's innocence. On the contrary, that was the very proposition put forth by the South Carolina court, which the United States Supreme Court expressly rejected in Holmes. So basically, if there is strong forensic evidence against the person that's being accused of this crime, this is a good time to use this Denny motion, this Denny ruling, to keep them from distracting from what they've done. Strong forensic evidence, which in this case against Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey, there is no strong forensic evidence, not any, nothing is strong. Every single thing that appears to be strong could be explained by planting. Could be. I'm not going to say that it is or was, but it could be. If you go with that planting defense, which is what they did, that since they were not allowed to introduce any third party as doing any planting of any other evidence, like the bones and the car and things like that, they went with what they thought that they might be able to prove, which would be that the blood vial was tampered with by the police. It had to be. It was in their custody. So it is possible that they could have planted the blood in the car, planted Stephen's blood in Teresa's car. Also with the key that didn't show up for several searches by trained people looking for evidence, something that would link Teresa to the property. They're looking for it. They can't find it until several searches later, when the two suspicious guys who really should not have been there in the first place happened to be searching, accompanied by a Calumet officer who was admittedly not watching them closely. So, in Holmes, the defendant was tried for rape and robbery of an elderly woman in her home. The prosecution relied heavily on forensic evidence that appeared strong. The defendant's palm print was found inside the victim's home. Fibers consistent with the defendant's sweatshirt and blue jeans were found on the victim's sheets and clothing, and blood and DNA evidence linked the defendant to the victim's underwear and tank top. However, as a major part of the defense, Holmes attempted to undermine the state's forensic evidence by suggesting that it had been contaminated and certain law enforcement officers had engaged in a plot to frame him. Holmes's expert witnesses criticized the procedures used by the police in handling the fiber and DNA evidence and in collecting the fingerprint evidence. Another defense expert provided testimony that Holmes cited as supporting his claim that the palm print had been planted by the police. That's a lot of evidence. That's a whole lot of evidence. We're talking fibers, DNA, blood, mixtures of blood from the victim and the offender. Palm prints, fingerprints. That's a lot of stuff to plant in a lot of different places. It's not the case against Stephen Avery. There was not a lot of this strong evidence. There were no fingerprints of Stephen Avery's or Brendan Dassey's found anywhere in or on Teresa's car. There was none of their DNA, none of their hair, none of their fibers, none of their anything found in or on her car except for Stephen Avery's blood. That's it. So this is not strong. And I'm sorry, I did forget the one part about the Stephen's DNA being underneath the hood latch of the RAV4, which again, I think as well could be explained either accidental or intentional planting, depending on which way you look at it and who. The defendant also tried to introduce evidence that another man had attacked the victim, but the trial court excluded the evidence, applying South Carolina's version of the Denny rule on grounds that it raised bare suspicion upon another. The United States Supreme Court acknowledged the constitutionality of rules like Denny that exclude defense evidence that does not sufficiently connect the other person to the crime, but also recognize a long line of cases which hold that, whether rooted in due process or the Sixth Amendment, the Constitution guarantees a criminal defendant a meaningful opportunity to present a complete defense. This right to present a defense is abridged by evidence rules which infringe upon a weighty interest of the accused and the arbitrary or disproportionate to the purposes they are designed to serve. I believe that in this case with Stephen Avery, this absolutely, without a doubt, kept him from putting on a meaningful, complete defense, because they were not allowed to introduce, I don't want to name names, they were not allowed to introduce very odd behavior and statements made by another of Teresa's customers. They were not allowed to introduce the fact that a roommate did not report her missing after saying that it was unusual and she had never stayed gone overnight before. He didn't report her missing at all. Several days go by and he didn't report her missing. The fact that someone was harassing her, according to her co-worker and business partner, someone was calling her constantly, harassing her. Someone obviously got into her voicemail, at least, we know for sure, on November 2nd, the morning of November 2nd, the day before she was even reported missing late that afternoon by her mother finally, after her co-worker called to ask her mother, hey, Teresa hasn't been here. Do you know anything about this? Is she all right? What's up? I find it really, really odd that the family, they said that they're so close. Teresa goes over to visit, all the time. They stay in constant contact. That they live like a quarter mile, I think, on the same property away from each other. That no one noticed for several days until her coworker called. No one noticed that. Sure, she's a young girl. She could be hanging out. She could be doing something and just not around. Okay, that's fine. Maybe that's not suspicious, but some investigation should have been done. Where was she then? Where did they think that she was? What was she doing before this time where she came up missing? What was going on in her life? These things were not looked into. The people who were close to her were not looked into. The people that she came into contact with, except for Stephen Avery, were not looked into. There's a lot of possibilities that were not looked into, and because of this Denny ruling, the defense was not allowed to really pursue that. And I think the worst, or the best or worst, depending on how you look at it, example would be when the defense is trying to question the singular expert on the stand and is trying to ask her about the voicemails, after they've already learned that Teresa's mailbox was full, and at some point some of her messages were deleted because several people had gotten the mailbox's full message on November 3rd. So at some point some of her voicemails were deleted, and she was able to get a new voicemail. I believe it was on November 11th. I might have that date wrong, I'm not sure, but it was several days later. Someone was able to leave a new message for her. That's after the testimony of another witness, but this witness was being questioned about, basically was just about to be questioned about who accessed her voicemail. Because we already know that it wasn't Teresa. It did not come, at least we know that it did not come from her physical phone. Someone called from another number and accessed her voicemail, and the defense was just about to get into asking who that was, when that was, what number was that. And this is something that they should have been allowed to pursue, because they really should have been allowed to bring that person up on the stand and demand answers. What were you doing getting into Teresa's voicemail on the morning of November 2nd, checking her voicemail? Explain this. I'm not going to say that whoever this person is the killer, but it damn sure should have been looked into, because it is a pretty strong possibility this person knows something. Some of her voicemails were deleted after that too, because when they were finally listened to, obviously the ones that the person didn't want heard were gone already. So the defense was just trying to get that information out there, just to let the jury know that, hey, somebody, just like they said in trial, somebody was accessing her phone at a very critical time going on here between the time that she came up missing or was last seen. Before she was reported missing, somebody's messing around in her phone, from a different number. Somebody's calling in her phone. Also, who was it that was repeatedly calling her and harassing her, stalking her? I mean, this would be something that you would think that the police would have looked into. But because of this third party Denny ruling, they weren't allowed to ask those questions. They weren't allowed to say, all right, well, we have this evidence. We know who you are. We're just going to go ahead and ask you these questions. They weren't allowed to do that. They weren't allowed to do that because they couldn't prove that this person killed Teresa. They could not prove that they killed her, or that they had motive to kill her. They might have been able to prove that they had opportunity and they were in the right proximity, but they couldn't prove motive, and they couldn't prove that they did it. So they weren't allowed to ask those questions, and I think a lot of people don't understand that really handicapped the defense. So much information that the jury should have heard was withheld from them because of this ruling, was not allowed to be presented to them because of this ruling. And from what I understand, several of the jurors who have now this is way over with, watched the documentary, have started to look into these things themselves, like a lot of us have, and they see all this information that they weren't given. So Kratz really saying that no one else out there but the jury got to hear all that evidence. Well, bullshit. The jury didn't even hear all the evidence. We know a hell of a lot more than the jury did. I can tell you that, because we've got every single bit of the evidence, the files, the documents, the everything, the transcripts. We have it all now, okay? All of it. Everything. Including your really shady behavior going on behind the scenes with your emails. Pretty sure you didn't introduce that to the jury, did ya? No. So, like I said, we have a lot of information. So, Kratz, don't you dare go around saying that the jury made the right decision because they had all the evidence that we don't have, because that is a complete lie. And like I've said 100 times before, please, I challenge anybody to look into this themselves. Don't listen to what you hear from me, from the documentary, from media, from anybody else. Look into it yourself and figure it out. See what it is that's there. There's tons of information that you can look at, and if you do, you'll see the same thing that so many of us see. And we all really just want justice for Stephen, Brendan, and Teresa. So please at least open up your mind to accept that it is possible that something really wrong happened here, and the wrong people are in prison, and the killer is free. At least do that for Teresa. If not for Stephen and Brendan. That's all I can ask for. Please look into it. I'll put the link to... There's several documents. I'll put the link to all of them. The state's side and the defense side, because they go back and forth. There's several of them going back and forth about this Denny ruling, trying to rebut it and ask for it to not be allowed, things like that. So I'll just link them all so that you can read them if you're interested. Like I said, the one... Cat's crazy. The one that I'm actually reading from is the defendant's response to state's motion to prohibit evidence of third-party liability, Denny motion. This one, it says filed June 28, 2006. Hopefully that helps to let you know which one of those documents I'm looking at. But like I said, I will link them all down below so you can read them. Thanks for watching.